Papua New Guinea is part of a large bird-shaped island whose beak points to Indonesia and whose feet points to Australia. Witchcraft, black magic, tribal warfares, all of these are part of the daily lives of the Papua New Guinean people. It is there, among the lush valleys and tall mountains, that an unsuspecting public health officer, Dr. Vincent Zegas, first witnessed Kuru. Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing fine. Today the topic we're going to discuss is Kuru and a lot of other different diseases, and I'm gonna talk about another book in the video. But first, let's talk about this mysterious disease, Kuru, that has perplexed scientists for half a century. The disease might now be extinct, but before extinction, this Kuru disease gave us a lot of insights into different neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and others. It all began in 1950 when Dr. Vincent Zegas was flying to Papua New Guinea in a really old red-sacked plane with just the pilot on board and himself. And when the pilot dropped him off to Papua New Guinea as a public health officer he was supposed to be, he only had some tractor parts, a few sheep, and kerosene oil. Born in Estonia, Dr. Vincent Zegas studied all over Europe, and he finally resided in Germany just when the Cold War began. He did not want to weather the Cold War, and so he enlisted himself as a public health official in Australia, and there he received some form of training and he was sent off to Papua New Guinea. When he first appeared in Papua New Guinea and to his medical building, the building was made up of wood and it had a lot of cracks in it, and all those cracks had a lot of vines grown into it so that the whole building looked like a living creature. The officials of the hospital, the workers of the hospital, they were not trained in this field at all. They did not know what they were doing. Most of the patient records had a very subtly written fever or bellyache, things like that. I think a correct word should be stomachache, but that's what's written in the book. It's bellyache. Even though Vincent was told that he would only need to practice medicine, he also had to practice a lot of surgeries as well, since there were no surgeons anywhere near that residence. The early unsuccessful surgeries caused a lot of nightmares for him. He was very much traumatized. Once a woman would come to him with hernia infection. She had this on her belly, and even though Vincent tried to remove the infection, he soon realized that the infection spread all over her belly. She died. He couldn't save her. Another time, a little child, only 4 or 5 years old, he had burns all over his body, and Vincent stayed up all night removing the burnt skin, exposing the pink flesh. Even after that, even after all the hard work, he could not save the boy. The boy died. But he soon became accustomed to the conditions that he was supposed to work on. He could easily fix bones of his patients, or he could remove the teeth from wild boars that had bitten the other tribe people. He could use maggots to treat infections because maggots, they would eat away the dead cells and leaving only the fresh cells or living cells healthy, and so they would heal faster. He soon gained popularity amongst the neighborhood and the neighboring villages, and soon he made a lot of friends as well, and 5 years passed. In 1955, he met an Australian contractor who was sent to Papua New Guinea by the Australian government so that he could build roads and other buildings and stuff like that. He was very drunk and he was sharing a lot of stories with a lot of people. He shared to Vincent that he once saw a woman in a distant village, and the woman was trembling. She could not walk properly. Her hands and legs were shaking vigorously when she was standing near a fire, so much so that the Australian would get anxious if she would fall into the fire herself. And she had this smile on her face, and all of these things really looked very interesting to Vincent. Now, Vincent did not believe in witchcraft and things like that, but he knew these symptoms had to be caused by either neurological or psychological diseases. Vincent was so much interested that he wanted to go to the village himself and see the patients with his own eyes. And the Australian said, well, he could arrange stuff so that he can go there. Several months passed. Suddenly, one day, there was a huge tribe person who came to Vincent with a letter in his hand. The person said his name was Apekono, and the letter was sent from the Australian. The letter was carefully covered with breadfruit leaves and was tightened with vines that were found locally. The letter was very short. It said, "Follow Apekono and bring some medicine with you if you can." The two men set onto their journey, and after walking and hiking for 2 days, going through swamps of leeches or getting through the bites of mosquitoes and running from their lives from black Papuan snakes, they finally reached the village where the Australian man resided. When they reached the village, Apekono pointed his finger to a woman who was sitting nearby, and the woman, when Vincent looked at her, she was shivering as if from cold, but the temperature was not that cold that she would shiver. And she had that smile, a disturbing smile on her face, and she looked at a distance, not focusing on Vincent or anyone. She just stared at the distant, emotionless. Apekono confirmed that the woman was in fact infected with the disease Kuru. A few days later, Vincent went to another village where he saw a lot of pigs just lying in the mud, and near one of the pigs, there was a woman and a young girl. The young girl was only probably 10 years old, and they were trying to delouse it and eat the lice because it was a common snack for the 4 tribe people that they were there at the moment. But no matter how hard the woman and the child tried, they could not feed themselves with the lice that they could not catch, and the lice would just run away into the mud and they would not be able to feed them. And when they saw Vincent, they would try to stand up and would fall to the ground, still smiling and shivering. Vincent returned to the village, his own village, and he was very much traumatized with the experience that he had with Kuru patients. He could not identify the disease, so he wrote letters with the symptoms of the disease, and he sent the letter to a lot of people all over the world so that anyone could identify the disease. But all of the letters that came back, he could conclude only one thing, that Kuru was a singular disease. Vincent Zigas came back to the village a year later, and when he asked around about the patients that he saw last year, they were all dead. Apekono took Vigas to one of his childhood friends, Taka. The two men greeted each other holding their testicles. This is a sort of ritual or a culture in Papua New Guinea. Taka looked very depressed, and he looked way older than for his age, which only gave away that he was very much in stress in his life. He told Apekono that his daughter had died from Kuru, and very recently his wife had gotten the disease. His wife, who just recently gave birth to a baby boy. When an infant cried nearby, Taka would go to the infant, his own son. He would take some sugarcane into his mouth along with some pig fat, and he would chew it and he'd smash it, and the mashed food, take it out of his own mouth and feed it to his child because his wife could not produce enough milk. Taka suddenly told the doctor that this woman cannot die. He just could not bear and fathom the fact that his wife was going to die. He loved his wife. Zigas came back to his own village again, and this time he wrote letters inviting scientists all over the world to come to Papua New Guinea and witness the disease for themselves. He did take a lot of investigations for himself. He investigated the local flora. He investigated the food habits of people. He investigated the local behaviors of the tribe, and he found something very interesting. He found that the Kuru disease was very much prominent and was very much common in women of the 4th tribe. Almost 60% of the Kuru patients were women, and 38% were children of any gender. Only 2% of the male were affected. This was very, very interesting data. Another interesting data was only the 4 tribal people had this disease in themselves, but the neighboring tribes, they did not have. This data perplexed our Dr. Vincent, and he wanted to carry out his research even further, and this time with funding from government. He took government funding and he set up his own lab and stuff. He set up his own Land Rover to travel to the village the next day. But just before he wanted to leave, a stranger came out of nowhere. Dr. Daniel Getsusak was a renowned American scientist and who had only known about Kuru from a different Papua New Guinean people. Even though his appearance did not speak for himself, he was a very much respected scientist, but he did have some issues, and Vincent first had his doubts about this person, about this doctor, because as far as he knew, Dr. Daniel did not care about people. He only cared about his research, and he did not want to look at the human side of the tribal people. So Dr. Vincent was very much skeptical and doubtful at the beginning, but he also knew that he had no other choice because Dr. Daniel was a very much capable scientist who could help him researching the disease. The newly scientist duo set up their own research facility at the heart of the Kuru epidemic. They had their own lab, they had their own morgue, and there would be a room where they would receive people from outside. They would send out word to the local tribe that they would donate the patient's dead body to them so that they could investigate their brain and the disease itself. They would cut the brains, look at the brains, they would take blood samples, they would carry out blood tests, urine tests, a lot of different tests, spinal fluid tests, but at the end of the day, they would not find a single reason for this disease to exist. They would not find any bacteria, fungi, or virus that would explain how this disease was being caused or if it was infectious, even though they knew that this disease was rather infectious. Hoping from help from outside world, they would take their research data, they would take their brain samples and send it to all over the world so that other scientists could relate any other disease to this. A professor at National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C. identified that the brain of Kuru patients were surprisingly similar to a different disease, a very rare condition. The name of the disease was Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and this was very, very rare. Vincent and Daniel found surprising similarities with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Kuru disease. In both cases, the patients had tremors in their hands and legs. They would shake violently and they would forget things. They would have trouble speaking. They would have slurred speech. And all of the similarities had another one, that they would all die within a year. So Vincent and Daniel concluded that whatever was causing Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease could also be the reason for the disease Kuru. Among these two diseases, a third disease appeared out of nowhere when in 1959, Vincent and Daniel had their research data presented or displayed at a museum, and a vet identified that he had seen very similar brain and symptoms of another disease called scrapie. And this disease did not have any human patient, but rather it had sheep. Sheep were affected by this disease, and they did show very, very similar tremors and forgetfulness and different behaviors and death within a year type symptoms. And all of those definitely did match with Kuru. The vet wrote letters to Daniel with all the symptoms and sheep research data. And when Daniel received the letter, he immediately knew what he was going to do. Daniel took the brains of Kuru patient that he had with him, he diluted it into a solution, and then he injected that solution into his lab-owned chimpanzee's blood. And within a few months, those chimpanzees definitely did develop a disease very similar to Kuru. Daniel's experiment definitely did prove that Kuru was 100% an infectious disease and it could be transmitted from one organism to another. For his work in 1976, Dr. Daniel received Nobel Prize. Dr. Vincent Zigas, in the meantime, he had taken himself away from the whole Kuru research, and he did not even explain why. He only said the reason was for circumstances beyond his control, and it was very cryptic. He did not ever explain why he left. And to this day, whenever we talk about Kuru or similar neurodegenerative diseases, Dr. Vincent Zigas is often looked over. After Dr. Daniel published his findings, it was very clear why the four tribal people were only getting the diseases. They had this weird ritual where they would dig up their own dead relatives or members from the grave, and the women of the tribe would use a knife to break open the skull, take the brain out, eat the brain, and take the leftovers home to feed their children. This was a ritual to honor their dead. This definitely does explain why the majority of the Kuru patients in those tribes were women and children. Another finding was that the four tribal people were endo-cannibalism. They followed endo-cannibalism. That means they would only eat the flesh from their own members, and particularly the brain. They would eat the brain. And since they would eat themselves, the disease, if anyone had this disease, if anyone died from this disease, those harmful substances that cause the disease would get into their own body and this disease would circulate. But the neighboring tribes, they did not practice eating among themselves. They would probably eat member from other tribes, but since they would not restrain themselves from eating their own dead, the disease could not take hold of themselves. Once the government banned cannibalism, the rate of Kuru decreased significantly after 1960, and to this day this is almost extinct. But the scientists were still unable to find what exactly caused Kuru. They would first, for example, they would first assume that it was because of the DNA. So they would take the patient's sample, tissue sample, and they would destroy all the DNA in it, and then they would inject it back into the animal's body, and the animals would still develop diseases similar to Kuru. So it was not the DNA that was problematic, and they still could not find any microorganisms that could be held responsible for this. So they were still perplexed. 10 years after Dr. Daniel received his Nobel Prize, and 10 years before he would later be accused of child molestation and lose all of his glory, a young neurologist named Stanley Prisoner was trying to find out exactly what caused Kuru-like diseases. So he would take brain tissue samples and would use the process of elimination, and he would create fractions of this solution or the sample, and every fraction he would make it into smaller and smaller and smaller fractions, and every time he would inject it into the subjects and see if they developed similar disease. Following this process, what they discovered was very fascinating. They discovered something responsible for diseases like Kuru, which was very, very smaller than a bacterium or a virus or a fungus. It was rather a molecule of a protein. Dr. Stanley would devote his life into this research, and this would become his life's work, and ultimately he would coin the term prions, from the words protein and infection, because this is one of the proteins that could cause an infection, and ultimately he would be receiving his own Nobel Prize. Even though Dr. Stanley's data was convincing, this raised more questions than answers, because primarily, first of all, proteins, well, they could not replicate themselves. So it did not make any sense how they were causing the infection. So for example, if I were to receive 10 molecules or 100 molecules of protein, that would be a very small amount, and it would not be enough to, show any symptoms of any diseases. They needed to be multiplied, just like any other microorganisms, but proteins did not do that. Another question the scientists had was, in case of autoimmune diseases, or proteins would either come from outside the body, or they would be produced due to some mutation because they were not supposed to be produced. Now, in case of prions, this was a problem because prion proteins were found in every human beings, and they were all perfectly fine. So what made those specific patients to have this disease? What different proteins that did they have? Following a lot of different experiments, Stanley found that prion proteins in healthy human beings were perfectly folded. They were perfectly frozen in place. But in case of patients with Kuru-like diseases, the same proteins unfolded and they crumpled onto themselves, and these caused the disease. And what they did was this disease-causing structure, this toxic structure, could influence other proteins nearby and cause them to take up the shape of these diseased forms. The mystery was sort of solved that these prion proteins, even though they could not replicate themselves, they could turn nearby normal proteins into the likes and the shapes of their own, so that they could also take part in contributing to the disease itself. Scientists now agree all over the world that prions are indeed infectious, and these different prions have been found to be responsible for other diseases like mad cow disease, fatal insomnia diseases where the patient has trouble sleeping. All of these different neurodegenerative diseases were directly linked to these prions. What we did not find is how we can cure this. There is no treatment for this disease. There is no cure for this disease. And even though in 2019, a group of scientists published a paper where they did show that DNA-like molecule did improve the health life of mice infected with a similar disease, it is yet to be applied to humans, and we are yet to find a cure. The story that we just heard right now was part of one of the 9 stories of this amazing book, A Molecule Away from Madness, written by Sara Peskin. And this book has 9 chapters. Each chapter deals with a different neurodegenerative disease caused by different reasons. There are 3 diseases that are caused by DNA mutations, 3 diseases that are caused by proteins, just like the Kuru one, and 3 diseases that are caused by invaders, like molecules from outside. The naming of the chapters are very interesting. La Bobera de la Familia is a really weird name. And Has Anyone Seen My Father is a very sad story it told. I felt very sad with the story. A Zombie Apocalypse was a very fun read. In this story, a young girl thinks she is some kind of zombie world where zombies are infecting the world and she has to survive all alone, just like the series called The Walking Dead. The particular Kuru chapter that we read, it was named Deadly Laughter because of how the patients would laugh very disturbingly when they did catch the disease. And An Honest Liar, like Lucifer, Filth Parties, these are all different diseases that she talks about, and the writing of this book is very interesting, as much interesting as the cover. The cover really shows a group of molecules, you may say, and there's one molecule separated, and this is exactly showing the title that we are always just one molecule away from being mad. So that was it for today, guys. If you do love my videos and if you do think you learned anything new, do share this video with your friends, and do give a like, and you can comment anything. If you have any other suggestions, you can tell them in my comment section. And goodbye, take care.